Chapter 8. The Fight with 3 Stars. We stayed at the soldiers' town this time until the grass was good in the moon when the ponies shed. May. Then my father told me we were going back to Crazy Horse and that we were going to have to fight from then on, because there was no other way to keep our country. He said that Red Cloud was a cheap man and wanted to sell the Black Hills to the Wasichus, that Spotted Tail and other chiefs were cheap men too, and that the hang around the fort people were all cheap and would stand up for the Wasichus. My aunt, who was living at the soldiers' town, must have felt the way he did, because when we were breaking camp she gave me a 6-shooter like the soldiers had, and told me I was a man now. I was 13 years old and not very big for my age, but I thought I should have to be a man anyway. We boys had practiced endurance, and we were all good riders, and I could shoot straight with either a bow or a gun. We were a small band, and we started in the night and traveled fast. Before we got to War Bonnet Creek, some Cheyennes, joined us, because their hearts were bad like ours, and they were going to the same place. Later I learned that many small bands were doing the same thing and coming together from everywhere. Just after we camped on the War Bonnet, our scouts saw a wagon train of the Wasichus coming up the old road that caused the trouble before. They had oxen hitched to their wagons, and they were part of the river of Wasichus that was running into the Black Hills. They shot at our scouts, and we decided we would attack them. When the war party was getting ready, I made up my mind that, small as I was, I might as well die there, and if I did, maybe I'd be known. I told Jumping Horse, a boy about my age, that I was going along to die, and he said he would too. So we went, and so did Crab and some other boys. When the Wasichus saw us coming, they put their wagons in a circle and got inside with their oxen. We rode around and around them in a wide circle that kept getting narrower. That is the best way to fight, because it is hard to hit ponies running fast in a circle. And sometimes there would be 2 circles, one inside the other, going fast in opposite directions, which made us still harder to hit. The cavalry of the Wasichus did not know how to fight. They kept together, and when they came on, you could hardly miss them. We kept apart in the circle. While we were riding around the wagons, we were hanging low on the outside of the ponies and shooting under their necks. This was not easy to do, even when your legs were long, and mine were not yet very long. But I stuck tight and shot with the 6-shooter my aunt gave me. Before we started the attack I was afraid, but Big Man told us we were brave boys, and I soon got over being frightened. The Wasichus shot fast at us from behind the wagons, and I could hear bullets whizzing, but they did not hit any of us. I kept thinking of my vision, and maybe that helped. I do not know whether we killed any Wasichus or not. We rode around several times, and once we got close, but there were not many of us, and we could not get at the Wasichus behind their wagons, so we went away. This was my first fight. When we were going back to camp, some Shaila warriors told us we were very brave boys and that we were going to have plenty of fighting. We were traveling very fast now, for we were in danger and wanted to get back to Crazy Horse. He had moved over west to the Rosebud River, and the people were gathering there. As we traveled, we met other little bands all going to the same place, until there was a good many of us all mixed up before we got there. Red Cloud's son was with us, but Red Cloud stayed at the soldiers' town. When we came to the ridge on the side of the Rosebud River, we could see the valley full of teepees, and the ponies could not be counted. Many people were there. Ogalalas, Hunkpapas, Minikonjus, Sandsarks, Blackfeet, Brules, Santies, and Yanktonais. Also many Shailas and Blue Clouds had come to fight with us. The village was long, and you could not see all the camps with one look. The scouts came out to meet us and bring us in, and everybody rejoiced that we had come. Great men were there, Crazy Horse and Big Road of the Ogalalas, Sitting Bull and Gull and Black Moon and Crow King of the Hunkpapas, Spotted Eagle of the Sandsarks, the younger hump and fast bull of the Miniconjus, dull knife and ice bear of the Shailas, Ink Paduta with the Santis and Yanktonais. Great men were there with all those people and horses. Hetchetualo. About the middle of the moon of making fat, June, the whole village moved a little way up the river to a good place for a sun dance. The valley was wide and flat there, and we camped in a great oval with the river flowing through it, and in the center they built the bower of branches in a circle for the dancers, with the opening of it to the east whence comes the light. Scouts were sent out in all directions to guard the sacred place. Sitting Bull, who was the greatest medicine man of the nation at that time, had charge of this dance to purify the people and to give them power and endurance. It was held in the moon of fatness, because that is the time when the sun is highest and the growing power of the world is strongest. I will tell you how it was done. First the holy man was sent out all alone to find the Wagachun, the holy tree that should stand in the middle of the dancing circle. Nobody dared follow to see what he did or hear the sacred words he would say there. And when he had found the right tree, he would tell the people, and they would come there singing, with flowers all over them. Then when they had gathered about the holy tree, some women who were bearing children would dance around it, because the spirit of the sun loves all fruitfulness. After that, a warrior, who had done some very brave deed that summer, struck the tree, counting coup upon it. And when he had done this, he had to give gifts to those who had least of everything, and the braver he was, the more he gave away. After this, a band of young maidens came singing, with sharp axes in their hands, and they had to be so good that nobody there could say anything against them, or that any man had ever known them, and it was the duty of anyone who knew anything bad about any of them to tell it right before all the people there and prove it, but if anybody lied, it was very bad for him. The maidens chopped the tree down and trimmed its branches off. Then chiefs, who were the sons of chiefs, carried the sacred tree home, stopping 4 times on the way, once for each season, giving thanks for each. Now when the holy tree had been brought home, but was not yet set up in the center of the dancing place, mounted warriors gathered around the circle of the village, and at a signal they all charged inward upon the center, where the tree would stand, each trying to be the first to touch the sacred place, and whoever was the first could not be killed in war that year. When they all came together in the middle, it was like a battle, with the ponies rearing and screaming in a big dust, and the men shouting and wrestling and trying to throw each other off the horses. After that there was a big feast and plenty for everybody to eat, and a big dance just as though we had won a victory. The next day the tree was planted in the center by holy men who sang sacred songs and made sacred vows to the spirit. And the next morning nursing mothers brought their holy little ones to lay them at the bottom of the tree, so that the sons would be brave men and the daughters the mothers of brave men. The holy men pierced the ears of the little ones, and for each piercing the parents gave away a pony to someone who was in need. The next day the dancing began, and those who were going to take part were ready, for they had been fasting and purifying themselves in the sweat lodges, and praying. First, their bodies were painted by the holy men, then each would lie down beneath the tree as though he were dead, and the holy men would cut a place in his back or chest, so that a strip of rawhide, fastened to the top of the tree, could be pushed through the flesh and tied. Then the men would get up and dance to the drums, leaning on the rawhide strip as long as he could stand the pain or until the flesh tore loose. We smaller boys had a good time during the 2 days of dancing, for we were allowed to do almost anything to tease the people, and they had to stand it. We would gather sharp spear grass, and then when a man came along without a shirt, we would stick him to see if we could make him cry out, for everybody was supposed to endure everything. Also we made pop guns out of young ash boughs, and shot at the men and women to see if we could make them jump, and if they did, everybody laughed at them. The mothers carried water to their holy little ones in bladder bags, and we made little bows and arrows that we could hide under our robes so that we could steal up to the women and shoot holes in the bags. They were supposed to stand anything and not scold us when the water spurted out. We had a good time there. Right after the sun dance was over, some of our scouts came in from the south, and the crier went around the circle and said, "The scouts have returned, and they have reported that soldiers are camping up the river. So, young warriors, take courage and get ready to meet them." While they were all getting ready, I was getting ready too, because Crazy Horse was going to lead the warriors and I wanted to go with him. But my uncle, who thought a great deal of me, said, "Young nephew, you must not go. Look at the helpless ones. Stay home and maybe there will be plenty of fighting right there." So the war parties went on without me. Maybe my uncle thought I was too little to do much and might get killed. Then the crier told us to break camp, and we moved over west towards the greasy grass and camped at the head of Spring Creek while the war parties were gone. We learned later that it was 3 Stars who fought with our people on the Rosebud that time. He had many walking soldiers and some cavalry, and there were many Crows and Shoshones with him. They were all coming to attack us where we had the sun dance, but Crazy Horse whipped them, and they went back to Goose Creek where they had all their wagons. My friend Ironhawk was there that day, and he can tell you how it was. Ironhawk speaks. "I am a hunk papa. I was 14 years old that summer, and I was a big boy. 2 war parties went out, a very large one from the south end of the camp and a small one from the north end. I went with the small one, and there were only about 40 of us. The big party got there early in the morning, and when we came, they had been fighting a long while. There is a wide valley there at the bend of the river with some bluffs and hills around it, and it looked as though people were fighting all over that place. There were Crows with the soldiers, and we began fighting with some of them. It looked as though we were getting the best of them. Then the soldiers began to advance on the other side of us, and we had to retreat. We were heading for where the big party was, but the soldiers were after us, and the Crows got braver and fought harder because of the soldiers. When we got to the bend, the Crows were right among us, and it was all mixed up fighting there. I don't know whether I killed anybody or not, but I guess I did, for I was scared and fought hard, and the way it was you couldn't keep from killing somebody if you didn't get killed, and I am still alive. There was a Lakota with me by the name of Without a Teepee, and a big crow pulled him right off his horse and he disappeared. Of course, I ran for my life, because we could not fight all those Crows and the soldiers too, and I was scared, but I was not running alone. We were all running, with the Crows after us. Then all at once we saw a band of cavalry coming right ahead of us, about 30 of them. I do not know how they got there. Maybe they were returning from a scouting trip. It looked bad for us. Then I heard voices crying in our language, "Take courage, this is a good day to die. Think of the children and the helpless at home." So we all yelled, "Hoka-hey," and charged on the cavalrymen and began shooting them off their horses, for they turned and ran. They were running toward their big party, and I could see many people were fighting over there, but everything was all mixed up, and you could not tell what was happening. It was a pitiful, long stretched out battle. They fought all day. Then the Crows were on us from behind, and we turned around and charged back on them, but many soldiers were behind them coming, so we all had to run crying, "Yah-hey," because there were not enough of us. By now I was very scared, and I ran for my life. I came to a rocky place, and my pony stepped between 2 stones and nearly tore his hoof off. There was a very brave Shaila by the name of Sitting Eagle. He was a friend of mine, and he had been with me in the fight. When I got off my pony to look at his hoof, a single crow was coming after me. Then I saw my friend, the Shaila, going to meet the crow. They fought hand to hand, and the crow went down. I wish I had stayed with Sitting Eagle, because then I could have been the first to coop that crow, but another man did it. I ran on foot, leading my horse, who was hopping on 3 legs. Then I saw smoke coming out of a deep gully where there was a creek. I went over to the smoke, and there were 3 Lakotas who had killed the bison and were having a feast right there while all the fighting was going on over the hill. They invited me, so I sat there and ate, for I was about 14 years old and I was always hungry. We had to watch out while we ate. One of the men took some clotted blood from the bison and put it in some raw bison hide and fastened it around my pony's hoof so that I could ride. After we had been eating there a long time, a Lakota came upon his horse with blood and dirt all over his face, and he was angry. He He said, "What are you doing here? We're fighting. All you think of is to eat. Why don't you think about the helpless ones at home? Come, make haste. We have got to stand our ground." I felt ashamed, so I got on my horse and we started. My horse could go better with his hoof tied up that way. We came to a ridge, and I could see all over the valley of the Rosebud where the fighting was going on. You could not tell who was getting whipped. It looked all mixed up. Some crows attacked us there, and I never got to the big party that was doing the hard fighting, but it was bad enough where I was, except when I was eating. I must have eaten a great deal, for it was evening now. Of course, when we got there, they had been fighting a good while already. We all came away when it was dark, to guard the women and children, and the enemy did not follow us. Of course, I thought the Wasichus had whipped us, but I learned it was not so. It was not a finished battle because the night stopped in, but the Wasichus got whipped anyway, and did not attack our village. They went back to their wagons on Goose Creek and stayed there. Standing Bear speaks. I was not in that fight. There were many who were not. The warriors came back in the dark, and everybody was so excited that nobody slept all night. The next morning, about 20 of us young fellows started out to see where the fight had been. First we saw a dead horse without shoes. Then we saw a dead horse with shoes. And near this one was a soldier full of arrows. We got to where the soldiers had camped after the fight, and there was a place where the ground was fresh and a big fire had been built on it. We started to dig there to see what was hidden. We got down on our hands and knees and dug in the loose ground. After a while we came to a blanket, and there was a dead soldier in it, and it was tied around his legs and waist and neck. We pulled him out, and one of the men said, "This is my blanket. I have been looking for this blanket. I will have this blanket." So he took it. Under that was another dead soldier tied up in a blanket, and then another and another under that. The fourth one was a black Wasichu. Each time somebody said, "This is my blanket," and took it. I got the fifth one, and the man inside was young, and he had a ring on his finger with a white stone in it that sparkled. I cut off the finger, and I had the ring for a long time. One of our men scalped a soldier and started home with a scalp on a stick. When we got on top of the ridge, we could see the soldiers of 3 stars retreating toward Goose Creek a long way off. A big dust was rising there. Then we went home. The village stayed at the head of Spring Creek several days. Then we all broke camp and moved over to the greasy grass. Chapter 9. The Rubbing Out of Long Hair. Black Elk continues. Crazy Horse whipped 3 stars on the Rosebud that day, and I think he could have rubbed the soldiers out there. He could have called many more warriors from the villages, and he could have rubbed the soldiers out at daybreak, for they camped there in the dark after the fight. He whipped the cavalry of 3 stars when they attacked his village on the powder that cold morning in the moon of the snow-blind, March. Then he moved farther west to the Rosebud, and when the soldiers came to kill us there, he whipped them and made them go back. Then he moved farther west to the valley of the greasy grass. We were in our own country all the time, and we only wanted to be let alone. The soldiers came there to kill us, and many got rubbed out. It was our country, and we did not want to have trouble. We camped there in the valley along the south side of the greasy grass before the sun was straight above, and this was, I think, 2 days before the battle. It was a very big village, and you could hardly count the teepees. Farthest up the stream toward the south were the Hunkpapas, and the Ogalalas were next. Then came the Miniconjus, the San Arcs, the Blackfeet, the Shailas, and last, the farthest down the north, were the Santees and Yanktonais. Along the side towards the east was the greasy grass, with some timber along it, and it was running full from the melting of the snow in the Bighorn Mountains. If you stood on a hill, you could see the mountains off to the south and west. On the other side of the river there were bluffs and hills beyond. Some gullies came down through the bluffs. On the westward side of us were lower hills, and there we grazed our ponies and guarded them. There were so many they could not be counted. There was a man by the name of Rattling Hawk who was shot through the hip in the fight on the Rosebud, and people thought he could not get well. But there was a medicine man by the name of Harry Chin who cured him. The day before the battle I had greased myself and was going to swim with some boys, when Harry Chin called me over to Rattling Hawk's teepee and told me he wanted me to help him. There were 5 other boys there, and he needed us for bears in the curing ceremony, because he had his power from a dream of the bear. He painted my body yellow, and my face too, and put a black stripe on either side of my nose from the eyes down. Then he tied my hair up to look like bear's ears, and put some eagle feathers on my head. While he was doing this, I thought of my vision, and suddenly I seemed to be lifted clear off the ground. And while I was that way, I knew more things than I could tell, and I felt sure something terrible was going to happen in a short time. I was frightened. The other boys were painted all red and had real bear's ears on their heads. Harry Chin, who wore a real bear skin with a head on it, began to sing a song that went like this. At the doorway the sacred herbs are rejoicing. And while he sang, 2 girls came in and stood, one on either side of the wounded man. One had a cup of water, and one some kind of herb. I tried to see if the cup had all the sky in it, as it was in my vision, but I could not see it. They gave the cup and the herb to Rattling Hawk while Harry Chin was singing. Then they gave him a red cane, and right away he stood up with it. The girls then started out of the teepee, and the wounded man followed, learning on the sacred red stick. And we boys, who were the little bears, had to jump around him and make growling noises toward the man. And when we did this, you could see something like feathers of all colors coming out of our mouths. Then Harry Chin came out on all 4s, and he looked just like a bear to me. Then Rattling Hawk began to walk better. He was not able to fight next day, but he got well in a little while. After the ceremony, we boys went swimming to wash the paint off. And when we got back, the people were dancing and having kill talks all over the village, remembering brave deeds done in the fight with 3 stars on the Rosebud. When it was about sundown, we boys had to bring the ponies in close. And when this was done, it was dark, and the people were still dancing around fires all over the village. We boys went around from one dance to another, until we got too sleepy to stay up any more. My father woke me at daybreak and told me to go with him to take our horses out to graze. And when we were out there, he said, "We must have a long rope on one of them, so that it will be easy to catch. Then we can get the others. If anything happens, you must bring the horses back as fast as you can, and keep your eyes on the camp." Several of us boys watched our horses together until the sun was straight above and it was getting very hot. Then we thought we would go swimming, and my cousin said he would stay with our horses till we got back. When I was greasing myself, I did not feel well. I felt queer. It seemed that something terrible was going to happen, but I went with the boys anyway. Many people were in the water now, and many of the women were out west of the village digging turnips. We had been in the water quite a while when my cousin came down there with the horses to give them a drink, for it was very hot now. Just then we heard the criers shouting in the Hunkpapa camp, which was not very far from us. "The chargers are coming! They are charging! The chargers are coming!" Then the crier of the Ogalallas shouted the same words, and we could hear the cry going from camp to camp northward clear to the Santees and Yanktonais. Everybody was running now to catch the horses. We were lucky to have ours right there just at that time. My older brother had a sorrel, and he rode away fast toward the Hunkpapas. I had a buckskin. My father came running and said, "Your brother has gone to the Hunkpapas without his gun. Catch him and give it to him. Then come right back to me." He had my 6-shooter too, the one my aunt gave me. I took the guns, jumped on my pony, and caught my brother. I could see a big dust rising just beyond the Hunkpapa camp, and all the Hunkpapas were running around and yelling, and many were running wet from the river. Then out of the dust came the soldiers on their big horses. They looked big and strong and tall, and they were all shooting. My brother took his gun and yelled for me to go back. There was brushy timber just on the other side of the Hunkpapas, and some warriors were gathering there. He made for that place, and I followed him. By now women and children were running in a crowd downstream. I looked back and saw them all running and scattering up a hillside down yonder. When we got into the timber, a good many hunkpapas were there already, and the soldiers were shooting above us so that leaves were falling from the trees where the bullets struck. By now I could not see what was happening in the village below. It was all dust and cries and thunder, for the women and children were running there, and the warriors were coming on their ponies. Among us there in the brush and out in the hunkpapa camp a cry went up, "Take courage! Don't be a woman! The helpless are out of breath." I think this was when Gall stopped the hunkpapas, who had been running away, and turned them back. I stayed there in the woods a little while and thought of my vision. It made me feel stronger, and it seemed that my people were all thunder beings, and that the soldiers would be rubbed out. Then another great cry went up out in the dust. "Crazy Horse is coming! Crazy Horse is coming!" Off toward the west and north they were yelling "Hoka-hey," like a big wind roaring, and making the tremolo, and you could hear eagle bone whistles screaming. The valley went darker with dust and smoke, and there were only shadows and a big noise of many cries and hoofs and guns. On the left of where I was I could hear the shod hoofs of the soldiers' horses going back into the brush, and there was shooting everywhere. Then the hoofs came out of the brush, and I came out and was in among men and horses weaving in and out and going upstream, and everybody was yelling, "Hurry, hurry!" The soldiers were running upstream, and we were all mixed there in the twilight and the great noise. I did not see much, but once I saw a Lakota charge at a soldier who stayed behind and fought and was a very brave man. The Lakota took the soldier's horse by the bridle, but the soldier killed him with a 6-shooter. I was small and could not crowd in to where the soldiers were, so I did not kill anybody. There were so many ahead of me, and it was all dark and mixed up. Soon the soldiers were all crowded into the river, and many Lakotas too, and I was in the water a while. Men and horses were all mixed up, and fighting in the water, and it was like hail falling in the river. Then we were out of the river, and people were stripping dead soldiers and putting the clothes on themselves. There was a soldier on the ground, and he was still kicking. A Lakota rode up and said to me, "Boy, get off and scalp him." I got off and started to do it. He had short hair, and my knife was not very sharp. He ground his teeth. Then I shot him in the forehead and got his scalp. Many of our warriors were following the soldiers up a hill on the other side of the river. Everybody else was turning back downstream, and on a hill away down yonder above the Santee camp there was a big dust, and our warriors whirling around in and out of it just like swallows, and many guns were going off. I thought I would show my mother my scalp, so I rode over toward the hill where there was a crowd of women and children. On the way down there I saw a very pretty young woman among a band of warriors about to go up to the battle on the hill, and she was singing like this: "Brothers, now your friends have come. Be brave, be brave. Would you see me taken captive?" When I rode through the Ogallala camp I saw Rattling Hawk sitting up in his teepee with a gun in his hands, and he was all alone there singing a song of regret that went like this: "Brothers, what are you doing that I cannot do?" When I got to the women on the hill, they were all singing and making the tremolo to cheer the men fighting across the river in the dust on the hill. My mother gave a big tremolo just for me when she saw my first scalp. I stayed there a while with my mother and watched the big dust whirling on the hill across the river, and horses were coming out of it with empty saddles. Standing Bear speaks. I am a Minneconjou, and our camp was third from the south. We got up late the morning of the fight. The women went out to dig turnips, and 2 of my uncles were hunting. My grandmother, who was very old and feeble, and one of my uncles and I stayed in a teepee. When the sun was overhead, I went back down to the river to swim, and when I came back, all I had on was a shirt. My grandmother cooked some meat in the ashes and fed us. While we were eating, my uncle said, "When you have eaten, you must go to the horses right away. Something might happen." An older brother of mine and another man were herding the horses in 2 bunches on Muskrat Creek, downstream below the Santee camp. Before I finished eating, there was an excitement outside. Then I heard our crier saying that the chargers were coming. When we heard this, my uncle said, "I told you before that something might happen. You'd better go right away and help bring the horses." I crossed the greasy grass, which was breast deep, and got on top of Black Butte to look. On the other side of the Hunkpapas toward the south, I saw soldiers on horseback spreading out as they came down a slope to the river. They crossed and came on at a trot. I started down the butte, but I was barefoot and there was a big bed of cactus there. I had to go slow, picking my way. A dust cloud was rising up yonder, and then I could see the Hunkpapas were running. And when I looked over onto the hills toward the south and east, I saw other soldiers coming there on horseback. I did not go to the horses. I went down through the cactus as fast as I could and into the village. There were voices all over, and everybody was shouting something and running around. After a while, my older brother came driving our horses, and my uncle said, "Hurry up, we shall go forth." I caught my gray horse and took my 6-shooter and hung my bow and arrows over my shoulder. I had killed a red bird a few days before, and I fastened this in my hair. I had made a vow that I would make an offering if this would keep me from getting hurt in the next fight, and it did. We started and went downstream to the mouth of Muskrat Creek beyond the Santee camp. We were going to meet the second band of soldiers. By the time we got there, they must have been fighting on the hill already, because as we rode up east from the mouth of Muskrat Creek, we met a Lakota with blood running out of his mouth and down over his horse's shoulders. His name was Long Elk. There were warriors ahead of us, the fronters, who are the bravest and have had the most practice in war. I was 16 years old, and I was in the rear with the less brave, and we had waited for our horses quite a while. Part way up, we met another Lakota. He was on foot, and he was bleeding and dizzy. He would get up, and then he would fall down again. When we got farther up the hill, I could see the soldiers. They were off their horses, holding them by the bridles. They were ready for us and were shooting. Our people were all around the hill on every side by this time. I heard some of our men shouting, "They are gone," and I saw that many of the soldiers' horses had broken loose and were running away. Everywhere our warriors began yelling, "Hoka-hey, hurry, hurry!" Then we all went up, and it got dark with dust and smoke. I could see warriors flying all around me like shadows, and the noise of all those hoofs and guns and cries was so loud it seemed quiet in there, and the voices seemed to be on top of the cloud. It was like a bad dream. All at once I saw a soldier right beside me, and I leaned over and knocked him down with the butt of the 6-shooter. I think I had already shot it empty, but I don't remember when. The soldier fell off and was under the hoofs. There were so many of us that I think we did not need guns. Just the hoofs would have been enough. After this, we started down the hillside in formation toward the village, and there were dead men and horses scattered along there too. They were all rubbed out. We were all crazy, and I will tell you something to show how crazy we were. There was a dead Indian lying there on his face, and someone said, "Scalp that Ree." A man got off and scalped him, and when they turned the dead man over, it was a Shaila, one of our friends. We were all crazy. We could see the women coming over now in a swarm, and they were all making the tremolo. We waited around there a while, and then we saw soldiers coming on a hill toward the south and east. Everybody began yelling, "Hurry!" and we started for the soldiers. They ran back toward where they came from. One got killed, and many of us got off and cooped him. Then we chased all the soldiers back to the hill where they were before. They had their pack mules and horses on the inside, and they had saddles and other things in front of them to hide themselves from bullets. But we surrounded them, and the hill we were on was higher and we could see them plain. We put our horses down under the hills so that they were safe. We all kept shooting at the soldiers and their horses. It was very hot, and there were some soldiers who started down the hill with kettles to get water from the river. They did not get far, and what was left of them went running back up the hill. I heard that some soldiers did get some water later, but I did not see them. Once a Lakota on the other side charged alone right up to the soldiers to show how brave he was, but they killed him, and we could not get his body. By now it was nearly sundown. I had not been feeling hungry because there was the smell of blood everywhere, but now I began to feel hungry anyway. The bravest of the braves got together and talked over what we should do that night. They decided that some of us should go home and eat and bring back something for those who stayed to watch the soldiers. We could not get at the soldiers, so we were going to starve and dry them out. I went back home with the others, and it was sundown then. At first I thought they had broken camp, but they had not. They had only gathered all the camps together in one solid village. I did not go back to the hill with the others that night. We built fires all over the camp, and everybody was excited. I couldn't sleep because when I shut my eyes I could see all those horrible sights again. I think nobody slept. Next morning early the crier went out and said, "The remainder of the soldiers shall die today." So after we had eaten, we all got ready. This time I was dressed and had my moccasins and leggings on. The day before I had only a shirt. This time I had my saddle too. I was prepared to fight. We all rode over there, and the party that had watched all night went home. We were scattered all around the soldiers, with our horses under the hill, but it was harder to hit the soldiers now, because they had been digging in the night. The day was very hot, and now and then some soldiers would start crawling down toward the river for a drink. We killed some of these. Then the others would run back. Maybe some got water, I do not know. We kept shooting at each other. Once I heard someone cry, "Hey, hey!" I crawled over there, and a Lakota had been shot above the eyebrow and he was dead. After a long while we heard that more soldiers were coming. Then everybody started back home, and there the people were saying, "We will leave this and let it go." Then we all broke camp and started for the Big Horn Mountains. If those soldiers had not come, we would have rubbed them all out on the hill. Elk Speaks. I am a Hunkpapa, and, as I told you before, I was 14 years old. The sun was overhead and more, but I was eating my first meal that day, because I had been sleeping. While I was eating, I heard the crier saying, "The chargers are coming." I jumped up and rushed out to our horses. They were grazing close to camp. I roped one, and the others stampeded, but my older brother had caught his horse already and headed the others off. When I got on my horse with the rope hitched around his nose, the soldiers were shooting up there and people were running and men and boys were catching their horses that were scared because of the shooting and yelling. I saw little children running up from the river where they had been swimming, and all the women and children were running down the valley. Our horses stampeded down toward the Miniconjus, but we rounded them up again and brought them back. By now warriors were running toward the soldiers and getting on the ponies, and many of the Hunkpapas were gathering in the brush and timber near the place where the soldiers had stopped and got off their horses. I rode past a very old man who was shouting, "Boys, take courage. Would you see these little children taken away from me like dogs?" I went into our teepee and got dressed for war as fast as I could, but I could hear bullets whizzing outside, and I was so shaky that it took me a long time to braid an eagle feather into my hair. Also, I had to hold my pony's rope all the time, and he kept jerking me and trying to get away. While I was doing this, crowds of warriors on horses were roaring by upstream, yelling, "Hoka-hey!" Then I rubbed red paint all over my face, and took my bow and arrows and got on my horse. I did not have a gun, only a bow and arrows. When I was on my horse, the fight upstream seemed to be over, because everybody was starting back downstream and yelling, "It's a good day to die." Soldiers were coming at the other end of the village, and nobody knew how many there were down there. A man by the name of Little Bear rode up to me on a pinto horse, and he had a very pretty saddle blanket. He said, "Take courage, boy. The earth is all that lasts." So I rode fast with him and the others downstream, and many of us Hunkpapas gathered on the east side of the river at the foot of a gulch that led back up the hill where the second soldier band was. There was a very brave Shaila with us, and I heard someone say, "He is going." I looked, and it was this Shaila. He had on a spotted war bonnet, and a spotted robe made of some animal's skin, and this was fastened with a spotted belt. He was going up the hill alone, and we all followed part way. There were soldiers along the ridge up there, and they were on foot holding their horses. The Shaila rode right close to them in a circle several times, and all the soldiers shot at him. Then he rode back to where we had stopped, at the head of the gulch. He was saying, "Ah, ah!" Someone said, "Shaila friend, what is the matter?" He began undoing his spotted belt, and when he shook it, bullets dropped out. He was very sacred, and the soldiers could not hurt him. He was a fine-looking man. We stayed there a while, waiting for something, and there was shooting everywhere. Then I heard a voice crying, "Now they are going, they are going." We looked up and saw the cavalry horses stampeding. They were all gray horses. I saw Little Bear's horse rear and race up hill towards the soldiers. When he got close, his horse was shot out from under him, and he got up limping because the bullet went through his leg, and he started hobbling back to us with the soldiers shooting at him. His brother friend, Elk Nation, went up there on his horse and took Little Bear behind him and rode back safe with bullets striking all around him. It was his duty to go to his brother friend even if he knew he would be killed. By now a big cry was going up all around the soldiers up there, and the warriors were coming from everywhere, and it was getting dark with dust and smoke. We saw soldiers running downhill right towards us. Nearly all of them were afoot, and I think they were so scared that they didn't know what they were doing. They were making their arms go as though they were running very fast, but they were only walking. Some of them shot their guns in the air. We all yelled "Ho-ka-hey" and charged toward them, riding all around them in the twilight that had fallen on us. I met a soldier on horseback, and I let him have it. The arrow went through from side to side under his ribs, and it stuck out on both sides. He screamed and took hold of his saddle horn and hung on, wobbling with his head hanging down. I kept along beside him, and I took my heavy bow and struck him across the back of the neck. He fell from his saddle, and I got off and beat him to death with my bow. I kept on beating him a while after he was dead, and every time I hit him, I said, "Houn!" I was mad, because I was thinking of the women and little children running down there, all scared and out of breath. These Wasichus wanted it, and they came to get it, and we gave it to them. I did not see much more. I saw Brings Plenty kill a soldier with a war club. I saw Red Horn Buffalo fall. There was a Lakota riding along the edge of the gulch, and he was yelling to look out, that there was a soldier hiding in there. I saw him charge in and kill the soldier and begin slashing him with a knife. Then we began to go towards the river, and the dust was lifting so that we could see the women and children coming over to us from across the river. The soldiers were all rubbed out there and scattered around. The women swarmed up the hill and began stripping the soldiers. They were yelling and laughing and singing now. I saw something funny. 2 fat old women were stripping a soldier who was wounded and playing dead. When they had him naked, they began to cut something off that he had, and he jumped up and began fighting with the 2 fat women. He was swinging one of them around, while the other was trying to stab him with her knife. After a while, another woman rushed up and shoved her knife into him, and he died really dead. It was funny to see the naked Wasichu fighting with the fat women. By now we saw that our warriors were all charging on some soldiers that had come from the hill upriver to help the second band that we had rubbed out. They ran back and we followed, chasing them up on their hill again where they had their pack mules. We could not hurt them much there, because they had been digging to hide themselves and they were lying behind saddles and other things. I was down by the river and I saw some soldiers come down there with buckets. They had no guns, just buckets. Some boys were down there, and they came out of the brush and threw mud and rocks in the soldiers' faces and chased them into the river. I guess they got enough to drink, for they are drinking yet. We killed them in the water. After a while it was nearly sundown, and I went home with many others to eat, while some others stayed to watch the soldiers on the hill. I hadn't eaten all day, because the trouble started just when I was beginning to eat my first meal. Black Elk continues. After I showed my mother my first scalp, I stayed with the women a while, and they were all singing and making the tremolo. We could not see much of the battle for the big dust, but we knew there would be no soldiers left. There were many other boys about my age and younger up there with their mothers and sisters, and they asked me to go over to the battle with them. So we got on our ponies and started. While we were riding downhill toward the river, we saw gray horses with empty saddles stampeding toward the water. We rode over across the greasy grass to the mouth of a gulch that led up through the buff to where the fighting was. Before we got there, the Wasichus were all down, and most of them were dead, but some of them were still alive and kicking. Many other little boys had come up by this time, and we rode around shooting arrows into the Wasichus. There was one who was squirming around with arrows sticking in him, and I started to take his coat, but a man pushed me away and took the coat for himself. Then I saw something bright hanging on this soldier's belt, and I pulled it out. It was round and bright and yellow and very beautiful, and I put it on me for a necklace. At first it tickled inside, and then it did not any more. I wore it around my neck for a long time before I found out what it was and how to make it tick again. Then the women all came over, and we went to the top of the hill. Gray horses were lying dead there, and some of them were on top of dead Wasichus, and dead Wasichus were on top of them. There were not many of our own dead there, because they had been picked up already, but many of our men were killed and wounded. They shot each other in the dust. I did not see Pahuska, and I think nobody knew which one he was. There was a soldier who was raising his arms and groaning. I shot an arrow into his forehead, and his arms and legs quivered. I saw some Lakotas holding another Lakota up. I went over there, and it was Chase in the Morning's brother, who was called Black Wasichu. He had been shot through the right shoulder downward, and the bullet stopped in his left hip because he was hanging on the side of his horse when he was hit. They were trying to give him some medicine. He was my cousin, and his father and my father were so angry over this that they went and butchered a Wasichu and cut him open. The Wasichu was fat, and his meat looked good to eat, but we did not eat any. There was a little boy younger than I was, who asked me to scalp a soldier for him. I did, and he ran to show the scalp to his mother. While we were there, most of the warriors chased the other soldiers back to the hill where they had their pack mules. After a while, I got tired looking around. I could smell nothing but blood, and I got sick of it, so I went back home with some others. I was not sorry at all. I was a happy boy. Those Wasichus had come to kill our mothers and fathers and us, and it was our country. When I was in the brush up there by the Hunkpapas, and the first soldiers were shooting, I knew this would happen. I thought that my people were relatives to the thunder beings of my vision, and that the soldiers were very foolish to do this. Everybody was up all night in the village. Next morning another war party went up to the hill where the other soldiers were, and the men who had been watching there all night came home. My mother and I went along. She rode a mare with a little colt tied beside her, and it trotted along with its mother. We could see the horses and pack mules up there, but the soldiers were dug in. Beneath the hill, right on the west side of the greasy grass, were some bullberry bushes, and there was a big boy by the name of Round Fool who was running around the bushes. We boys asked him what he was doing that for, and he said, "There is a Wasichu in that bush." And there was. He had hidden there when the other soldiers ran to the hilltop, and he had been there all night. We boys began shooting at him with arrows, and it was like chasing a rabbit. He would crawl from one side to the other while we were running around the bush shooting at him with our bows. Once he yelled, "Ow!" After a while we set fire to the grass around the bushes, and he came out running. Some of our warriors killed him. Once we went up the back of the hill, where some of our men were, and looked over. We could not see the Wasichus, who were lying in their dug-ins, but we saw the horses and pack mules, and many of them were dead. When we came down and crossed the river again, some soldiers shot at us and hit the water. Mother and I galloped back to the camp, and it was about sundown. By then our scouts had reported that more soldiers were coming upstream, so we all broke camp. Before dark we were ready, and we started up the greasy grass, heading for Woodlouse Creek in the Big Horn Mountains. We all fled that night. We fled all night, following the greasy grass. My 2 younger brothers and I rode in a pony drag, and my mother put some young pups in with us. They were always trying to crawl out, and I was always putting them back in, so I didn't sleep much. By morning we reached a little dry creek and made camp and had a big feast. The meat had spots of fat in it, and I wish I had some of it right now. When it was full day, we started camp and came to Woodlouse Creek at the foot of the mountains and camped there. A badly wounded man by the name of Three Bears had fits there, and he would keep saying, "Jinniny, Jinniny." I do not know what he meant. He died, and we used to call that place the camp where Jinniny died. That evening everybody got excited and began shouting, "The soldiers are coming." I looked, and there they were, riding abreast right toward us. But it was some of our own men dressed in the soldiers' clothes. They were doing this for fun. The scouts reported that the soldiers had not followed us and that everything was safe now. All over the camp there were big fires and kill dances all night long. I will sing you some of the kill songs that our people made up and sang that night. Some of them went like this. Long Hair has never returned, so his woman is crying, crying. Looking over here, she cries. Long Hair, guns I had none. You brought me many, I thank you. You make me laugh. Long Hair, horses I had none. You brought me many, I thank you. You make me laugh. Long Hair, where he lies nobody knows. Crying, they seek him. He lies over here. Let go your holy irons, guns. You are not men enough to do any harm. Let go your holy irons. After a while I got so tired dancing that I went to sleep on the ground right where I was. My cousin, Black Wasichu, died that night.